So yesterday I watched a film called The Brutalist, directed by Brady Corbett, and I had a lot of thoughts about it, so I just kind of wanted to get it out there. Um, and also, I'm not gonna give like really a rundown of the plot per se. I'm more so gonna get into my issues with the film and some praise for some stuff that I did like about it. So if you haven't watched it, either go watch it now, but be warned it's like 3.5 hours long, or keep watching and I'll be citing to the specific parts that I'm talking about. Um, so my overall takeaway from the film was that I quite like what it was trying to explore about anti-Semitism and how it affects people, specifically people like the main character who is a Jew who immigrated from Hungary after the Holocaust to the United States. And it feels like the film kind of tries to touch on the nuances of anti-Semitism, specifically compared to other types of bigotry, as well as the effect that the Holocaust and generational trauma had on people. So my feeling was that the first half of the film touched on this subject significantly better than the second half. The second half felt very on the nose to me, and like it lost a lot of nuance by being so extreme in the way it manifested it. Although, to be fair, that did exist somewhat in the first half as well, but to a lesser degree. And so, to talk about that, I want to talk about, specifically for me, as a Jewish person, I feel like something that's very unique to anti-Semitism, and granted this might apply to other types of discrimination, but it feels very much so like it's a very prevalent thing for anti-Semitism, is that for white passing Jews, such as myself, and a lot of Ashkenazi Jews at the time as well, there's something very tricky about the way that anti-Semitism plays out, because you're told you're accepted by a white society, by the majority, by the powers that be, but whenever you're no longer wanted, you're very, very swiftly reminded that you're still Jewish and you're still not the in-group, and that at any moment you can be kicked out. This creates a sense where basically people will start getting comfortable in an area, feel like they're accepted, they're able to be a part of the community maybe, but their identity is always kind of a risk factor insofar as the fact that, again, the white majority in those areas can always decide that they no longer want them there and kick them out. This is pretty demonstrated, obviously, with before the Holocaust in a bunch of European countries that later got affected by the Holocaust. Some people that try to integrate into that society, while not wholly being accepted and still encountering a lot of anti-Semitism, some of them might have managed to have some sense of integration and acceptance by that society, only to later be kind of stepped in the back and be reminded you're still a Jew after all. So I quite like the fact that the first half, I feel this talked about this in what felt like a somewhat nuanced and interesting way. So, for example, we had, in the very start of the movie, we see our lead character, Laszlo, who's played by Adrian Brody, who was genuinely brilliant in this role. I have zero complaints for him in this movie. So we see him go to stay with his cousin, who now lives in the United States, specifically New York, if I remember correctly. And his cousin married someone who's a Catholic woman, and decided to also change his last name to be less Jewish. And basically we get the sense that he's very much so integrated into society and tried to remove a lot of the Jewishness of him, basically, to where he would not be detected by society around him. So something kind of interesting is the fact that at some point you see that Laszlo being around irritates his cousin, and his cousin decides to get rid of him and accuse Laszlo of trying to flirt with his wife and all these kinds of things. And that to me very much so read as a very nuanced and interesting way of showing how Jews that try to integrate and erase their Jewishness to become like, to just become one with that society that they live in, often will turn on Jews that don't do so, and will blame them for not doing so, and will look at them as a risk. This is obviously something you can see in other communities as well, like the idea of like, oh, you just need to do that and that, you know, Bill Cosby's whole like, pull your pants up, stop sagging your pants, all these kinds of things, of like, you just need to be basically like a perfect minority so that people will stop hating us, kind of thing. And I feel like it's done in a quite nuanced way, where the cousin never quite tells him that, but we see all these kinds of symbols of like, okay, he's married someone who's not Jewish, which on its own is not a problem, but he then also changes his name to sound less Jewish, all these different things, which makes it very clear that he's trying to distance himself from his Jewishness as much as possible. Another interesting factor that I feel was quite disappointing in the way that it was not at all explored is that earlier on in the film, Laszlo makes a friend whose name is Gordon, who is black and has a son. And I initially thought, oh, this is interesting. They might kind of delve into the way that anti-Semitism affects people differently than how racism for black people impacted them, especially if we're talking about something like the 1950s. And I especially thought that this might be brought up because at some point as well, whenever Laszlo and Gordon are both participating in doing some renovations for some guy who later on gets annoyed at them because his son is the one that got the renovation and he didn't approve of it. He calls Gordon the N-word, basically, or refers to him as such. But he warms himself back up to Laszlo, and I thought, oh, there might be some interesting dynamic there where Laszlo is accepted and Gordon isn't. And it might touch on kind of the interesting nuances of how black people never even get their foot in the door because they're never even perceived as possibly acceptable, whereas Jewish people get the sense of like, we're going to get close to you and we're going to let you in, but you're always going to be reminded that your being here is just because we're being nice to you, basically. And sadly, later on in the film, there's a line that states this in a very on-the-nose, not subtle at all way, where the man who got the renovation, his son, tells Laszlo, "We tolerate you," which emphasized my point perfectly, but was quite on the nose, and I feel lost a lot of the nuance that the film had earlier on with the way that it was portrayed. But insofar as Gordon and the kind of comparison between the different kinds of bigotry here, it does not at all get touched on at the point where Laszlo starts working for this man, Van Buren, who's played by Guy Pearce, who also was fantastic in this film. He just gets Gordon to keep working with him, and that's never touched on, and Gordon's character is not at all developed, really. There's just a minor point later on where Laszlo's niece, who lost her mother, is there at dinner with Laszlo and his wife, and with Gordon and his son, and they make a parallel between her having lost her mother and him having and Gordon's son having lost his mother. But again, none of it is really explored in any way, and even that parallel is kind of just left there. I thought they might do something where the two might kind of get closer over it, and we might see kind of the way that different minorities, while experiencing different kinds of discrimination, might be able to come together and have some understanding of what it's like to be discriminated against. Again, does not at all get developed. And another thing that kind of pointed to the whole ways that anti-Semitism manifests itself that was interesting to me is there's a part where so there's Van Buren, who's the main guy who owns this house, he's rich, all these things, and then there's his son Harry. There's a point where Harry specifically is kind of shown being a little weird to Zsofia, who's Laszlo's niece, and seeming to somewhat come on to her or something like that, also telling Laszlo something like she's quite a nice sight or something. And it's kind of implied he's being inappropriate or wants to be inappropriate with her. And there's something really interesting in the way it's portrayed where it's kind of not really too on the nose. It's not like he's going up to her and like intentionally touching her or very explicitly doing something not okay, which again I feel like is interesting because it touches on the kind of nuanced way where Laszlo hears this and kind of doesn't have anything to do about it, because him being around these people, him being accepted into this society, is always dependent on the powers that be allowing him to be there. He's not there because he's a part of the in-group, he's there because the in-group decided that he's allowed to be there. And so he's kind of powerless to fight against this. But later on in the film, there's a scene where Van Buren, again played by Guy Pearce, just blatantly sexually assaults Laszlo when Laszlo is very drunk. And to me, again, this completely lost its nuance there. It did not at all make any real sense as to why Van Buren's character would do this. He already demonstrated that he's very kind of that he has power over Laszlo, but it never felt like he's trying to assert it, but rather that he's not at all caring about it. So, for example, there's a point where he decides to just halt the project and tells everyone to just go home. He does not for a second stop to think how that affects Laszlo and the other workers. He cares about the fact that he stopped the project because there was some accident that happened and he's now worried about his money. Something like that, for example, was a great way to portray the fact that he has power and he still does not actually care about Laszlo, and again, Jewish people specifically, he cares about them just insofar as they serve his interests. And whenever they're not comfortable for him, he does not treat them as human. He does not care about their well-being at all. But in the assault scene, it becomes like he's trying to assert power over him, which does not at all really make sense for his character, and is not really established as something that he would want to do. He is established as someone who very much so holds to his own principle. Like, we're told a story where his grandparents, who were not nice to his mom and kind of threw her out because she got pregnant out of marriage, he wrote them a check and he asked them why they need the money, and they basically just didn't give him a good reason for why that would be good for them. And then he left the house, and they're like, "Oh, you forgot to sign your name." And he's like, "No, I didn't forget. That was intentional." So it's more portrayed like he's doing that because those people were bad to his mother and didn't apologize and didn't care. And so again, nothing is really establishing this idea that he just likes asserting power over people. And it made him a lot more kind of cartoony rather than realistic and just someone who's in power and doesn't truly care about Jewish people and doesn't understand the ways that they are affected by his actions, which honestly is true regardless of even the Jewish status, but it just even more so plays into it because he's now dealing with people that are also disenfranchised in society. So it just ended up feeling quite odd and not established at all for his character. And this kind of leads me to another thing of Laszlo's drug abuse, which is something that's constantly throughout the film shown to us, that he abuses drugs. And I believe they kind of give an explanation of he broke his nose and they gave him some medication, which don't know if it was opium or heroin or something of the sort, and he gets addicted to it. This on its own, with Brody's acting, felt like it was trying to kind of portray him as this man who's very much so shut himself off from other people, which we see throughout the film as well. He does this whenever he's reunited with his wife and niece as well. And that basically he's just kind of repressing all the trauma that happened to him in the Holocaust and all these things, and is using drugs basically as an escape. The kind of annoying thing is that this is never really delved into, and it doesn't need to be from the perspective of him, because again, I understand the point that he's just shut off. The problem is that this is why we needed people around him, or rather the characters around him, to be tools to kind of explore that. And this is where a huge criticism I have for the film is that his wife's character, Erzsébet, I believe is how it's pronounced, was not at all effective. I initially was somewhat bothered by her casting with Felicity Jones, who I don't really mind the fact that she's not Jewish as much as the fact that she does not at all look Jewish, which made it a little bit odd, because she's supposed to be also someone who's kind of treated in an anti-Semitic way. But again, maybe this is just me, maybe this is just because I'm around Jewish people, it just screamed to me, like, the fact that she's not Jewish at all. And it felt quite odd, especially when you see her next to Adrian Brody, who's very, very clearly Jewish. And even the actress who was brought in to play Denise looked like she could be possibly Jewish, and it just felt very odd. But even besides that, because I'm not, and to be clear, I'm not someone who thinks, like, you can't play any character if you're not actually of that thing. Like, I don't think, like, straight actors can ever play gay people or anything like that. It just feels quite odd when this person's very clearly not that. It's like if you brought in, like, a white person to play a black character where they talk about their oppression. It would be, like, weird and take you out of it. But additionally, her acting was not up to par with everyone else, which was quite disappointing, especially in scenes where, again, I feel like her character was very much so needed for us as an audience to see the ways that Laszlo is kind of shutting himself off and self-destructing. Even in the assault scene, Van Buren kind of says to him, your people have constantly been so oppressed, why do you also hurt yourself? And this is again brought up in a very blunt way, in a scene that to begin with feels odd in the film, and rather than it being something about his trauma is making him hurt himself even further, and it being something that's kind of in a nuanced way explored, and maybe through his wife, who knew him before this as well, explored, it just ends up being very not really delved into in depth. And again, I will say Adrian Brody was terrific in this, and I feel like any nuance and idea that I did get of this character being someone who just shut himself off did very much so come from his performance, which was very nuanced and just amazing, where he felt very, like, shut off, but you could see little glimpses of him kind of crying on the inside coming through. So another thing, back to the point of the needing to kind of pander to the majority and all these things, another thing that was really interesting to me that I felt was actually quite nuanced and nice was that Van Buren wanted Laszlo to design a town for him, and there's some explanation in the story that something like the Christian community in the town that's allowing them to do this decided that they have to have something, they have to have like a church there or something like that, and basically to appease them, Laszlo decided to build this thing on the roof that has within it, like, hollowed out areas that will create, whenever the sun is moving behind it, will create on the ground the image of a cross. And it's, like, placed right at the top of all the buildings. I thought this was, like, an interesting visual way to represent this idea of, like, he needs to basically, even within his work and his self-expression, put this pandering and the erasure of his Jewishness above all. He needs to do that to be accepted and allowed to express himself. And one of the parts that I really loved in the film was actually a conversation between him and Van Buren, where Van Buren asks him, why architecture? And he talks about how he felt like during the Holocaust, everything was taken away from him, was robbed from him, and afterwards, seeing that the buildings he designed, despite everything, lasted the trial of time and still remained there as a statement, was something that I really liked and is touched on later on in the film, at the end of the film, where we see Zsofia talk about his work when he's significantly older in front of a bunch of people in a museum that has displays of images of the architecture that he did, where she talked about how the town that he designed was reminiscent of basically of the concentration camps that he was in, and the way that he reimagined it with little windows at the top to kind of let some light through and all these things. And again, tied it back to the idea of like how his art kind of represented his experience and was somewhat of a window into what he's going through despite him being so shut off. And I also liked that while the ending did explore this in a way that was somewhat blunt, it felt very appropriate because there's an explanation for why it's being done. And the actress who portrayed her older version was also great in this. Who, by the way, if anyone watching knows who Yorgos Lanthimos is, she both was in a bunch of his films as well as she's married to him. So I felt like that was an interesting thing that was touched on. And another part that was really interesting is because the whole film kind of talks about this thing that's a very well-known issue for Jews of, do we try to integrate into the society and try to just erase our Jewishness, or do we kind of keep to our own and just remain Jewish? Because it's very clear that general society is not going to let us maintain our Jewishness while integrating. So another kind of interesting thing that was brought up is the idea that later on in the film, in the second half, Zsofia gets married and is pregnant, and her husband decide to move to Israel. And she talks to Elizabeth and Laszlo about how basically this is like a place for us to be Jewish and not need to be apologetic and anything like that. And especially with the fact that also earlier on in the film, as Laszlo is working, they're playing the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. I thought this as well kind of was an interesting way to tie all this stuff in. But again, my overall criticism of the film is that so much of it felt very on the nose at some point with the way that it took, the way that anti-Semitism does manifest itself when you try to remain Jewish while existing in that society. And I'm kind of disappointed because, again, there were so many glimpses of things that were interesting ways to kind of touch on this. Like, again, whether it be the way that it shines through his, like, architecture, whether it be the fact of Zsofia talking about how Israel is basically a safe haven for them to be Jews in, or any of these things, and it just kind of ends up being very disappointing in the fact that it doesn't really delve into any of it that well, and whenever it does explore the way that they're being treated in an anti-Semitic way, while starting off in a nuanced, interesting way, it ends up developing to something that feels very kind of cartoonish and on the nose, with the assault scene also leading to later on Elizabeth deciding to confront the family and telling them that Van Buren assaulted her husband, to the son kind of kicking her out, and the daughter, and Van Buren's daughter, who is always portrayed as having been kind of nice, coming to her aid and all this stuff and just being like, I'm so sorry. Which again, I feel like there's something interesting to discover there of like not knowing whether that woman is actually nice because she genuinely cares and feels bad for you, but still, despite doing that, still is defending her dad, or if she's genuinely someone who, despite her upbringing, does have some actual sympathy and empathy to the Jewish plight. And again, not at all really touched on or discovered. And one more thing that I really want to point out is just that the cinematography of the film is absolutely beautiful. It manages to be very unique, despite not being show-offy. Even the indoor scenes are lit in a very interesting and unique way. And I feel like that also greatly contributed to the film, especially with the framing at some point where, in the last scene, where we see, or the last part rather of the film, where we see Zsofia talk about Laszlo's work, and we cut to parts of the buildings that he built the framing of them is very intentional and very good at communicating the way that he saw them and what it meant to him. And even just that small segment, which is so great visually. And again, overall the film was just terrific visually. The soundtrack was also quite good and managed to kind of meld into the movie really well. I also read that apparently the guy who made the soundtrack for the film also instructed the synagogue that is in one of the scenes, I believe is supposed to be. He instructed them so that their singing basically kind of flows into the soundtrack naturally, which is really cool. And the guy who made the soundtrack is also Jewish and talked about, or rather maybe is talked about as having been a part of a synagogue and how that kind of tied into his upbringing. But at the end of the day, I feel like a lot of the film's issues kind of come down to the fact that it does feel like someone who has an understanding of the Jewish plight, and again, this big struggle that I think is very much so at the heart of a lot of anti-Semitism, of do you integrate or do you keep to yourself, in this sense of like, you're acceptable until you're not. It feels like it's written by someone who understands that and has genuine sympathy for it, but clearly doesn't understand all the nuances of having experienced it, which makes sense given the fact that Brady Corvette said he had some distant Jewish relative in his family, but that the film itself is more so influenced by stories told to him by his godmother and his times where he went with her to synagogue. But I feel like, again, a lot of it very much so does read like someone who hasn't felt what anti-Semitism feels like. So I guess just as a little note at the end, whether you're someone who's Jewish and feel like you've experienced this and you might be able to relate to it, or maybe you don't, maybe you feel like you don't relate at all to this, or you're someone who's not Jewish who's watching this, and just to explain, I guess, my sense of it, especially as someone who lives in Israel, there's a very weird experience I had with anti-Semitism where it feels like something of the past or something that's just exists in its most cartoonish forms, and you have kind of a moment where kind of this bubble around you pops and you realize how real and how more nuanced it is than you thought it is. So for me, a lot of it was starting to interact in more international spaces, talking to people abroad that are from abroad and stuff like that. And there's something quite odd because living in Israel, being Jewish is being the majority, is being the powers that be. So you never felt like you're really targeted for it nearly as much. Maybe from countries in the surrounding area. There's definitely anti-Semitism involved with some of the fight over the land here. Well, obviously that's not the entirety of it. You don't quite feel it as directly. You don't experience interpersonal anti-Semitism really that much here, if at all. Unless maybe you live in like much more mixed areas, which I didn't grow up in areas like that at all. But once you start interacting with people outside of that, you start having this weird sense where while you're constantly told, like, you're not actually oppressed, you're white passing, stop whining, nobody's treating you differently because you're Jewish, at the same time, it's very comfortable to actually treat you. It's comfortable for the people that are anti-Semitic to be anti-Semitic to you in the nuanced ways that it exists, where it's not blatantly, I hate you because you're Jewish, while also the people around them are, in a sense, gaslighting you while not intentionally, just because of the fact that they're very blind to the fact that while to them you just appear like any other white person, or white passing person, I guess, you're not. And the people that don't like you for it will definitely treat you that way, but the people that don't will often not listen to you talk about that. And again, I feel like the film disappointed me because I feel like this is something that I've thought a lot about recently, and I think is a very interesting and important topic to discover, or not topic, discover, to explore rather. But the film completely misses the mark with the fact that it becomes so extreme with it, rather than, again, even if we're talking about the way that sexual assault can play into it, something like the implied idea that Zsofia might be at risk of that at the hands of Harry, and the fact that Laszlo is completely powerless against that, the fact that he doesn't even feel like he can speak up against it because he knows the power that be don't want him shaking the boat. If he shakes the boat even a little bit, he's out, because his stay there is very conditional. And so, yeah, I guess that's it. I'd recommend it overall still. The performances, for the most part, are great, and again, cinematography is beautiful, but I was quite disappointed with the fact that it misses a lot of stuff. So, yeah, I don't know how to finish it, so bye.